All right, so this is the first video where I actually want to start to get into some specific study strategy or one specific study strategy. And what I want to talk about is retrieval practice, or sometimes you'll hear this described as active recall. And so retrieval practice is a very powerful way to promote learning. So a lot of the techniques we're going to talk about today are the ones that, studies have kind of consistently shown that they have positive effects for the learning. Not that other strategies aren't effective and things like that. And we're going to go through some really great ideas for how you can boost your studying. But, if there was one kind of thing that you probably want to make a big part of your study routine, it's some of the things we're going to talk about in this, or I'm going to talk about in this video of, building in retrieval practice or active recall. This is very powerful effects on our learning. So when we think of students studying, a lot of times they spend a lot of times kind of rereading notes. They may take notes in class on paper, or maybe on their computer, or maybe you just have PowerPoint slides from class that were kind of, going through what the instructor talked about, and you may, have those, and you might just kind of reread through them, right? You'll go through them and you'll say, okay, maybe go back to the beginning, reread them again. That's really how I studied a lot as an undergraduate, and then even into graduate school, right? I would just kind of reread my notes. I'd hunker down at a spot in the library and I'd sit down and I'd go through my notes, and then I'd start from the beginning. I'd go through my notes and start from the beginning. And it felt effective in the moment, right? Because every time I passed through my notes, I became more familiar with them. I could almost know the order of the slides. I knew the examples that were coming. I knew all that, right? The problem with the approach is it doesn't involve retrieving information from memory. I was just kind of reading through what had been talked about in class, very passive, right? It didn't require me to kind of dig through my brain a little bit and pull information forward, which when you think about it, that's what your instructor is going to ask you to do during an exam. Or probably more importantly, that's what you're going to need to do when a patient asks you a question, right? You're going to have to, find where that information is stored deep in the recesses of your brain and be able to extract it, pull it forward, and apply it, right? So that's what retrieval practice is really all about. It's building in those opportunities for you to pull information forward from memory. Because again, these passive approaches like rereading lecture notes, they're great ways to become familiar with your notes, but that's not your goal. Your goal is to be able to kind of retain information when your notes aren't there anymore, and then be able to kind of pull it forward in the future when you need that information, again, when you're taking a test or working with a patient or something like that. So again, when we talk about retrieval practice, it's really attempting to retrieve information from memory. And there's a lot of evidence that retrieval practice promotes learning in a lot of different contexts, right? It can be basic science courses, it can be other, topics and stuff like that. There's one of those things that a lot of the research, has been applied, more basic science studies, more applied studies, like in a classroom setting, college students, younger students. In most cases, retrieval practice has been shown to be highly effective. So this is something you definitely want to build into your study routine. So really, there's a neurological basis for this. If you look at, there's some imaging studies that have kind of looked at what areas of the brain become active when we call the recall information from memory and stuff like that. And this process of trying to store and retrieve information from memory really activates these areas that are important for long-term memory. So there's kind of a neurologic basis for why this kind of retrieval practice tends to be effective. It's kind of like creating these neural connections that are going to be needed for us to, again, be able to store information and then be able to retrieve it when needed, right? So it's kind of an interesting thing. I won't go into details here, but it's really interesting, the neurophysiological basis for this as a studying approach and how it improves our memory and things like that. So I want to look in the literature, and I just want to highlight couple basic studies. This isn't the only experiments that's been done in this topic. I just think there are some that really highlight the point well. So this was a couple of studies I'm going to highlight by Henry Roediger and Jeffrey Karpicki, who are big names in the area of the science of learning and those kinds of things, cognitive psychology. So their first experiment, they had 120 undergraduate students, college students, right? And they asked them to memorize written passages. I think the passages were about something like the atmospheric conditions of the sun and some other topic, right? Basic science passages. Again, the goal was to see if, to experiment with, is there a better way to get students to retain important concepts from readings, right? So the students either studied the passages twice, So they would kind of study it, or in that way just read the passage, and then they would study it again and just reread it, right? So it's equivalent to what would happen if you just kind of read through your notes multiple times, right? So that's my study condition, right? They do read the passage and then reread it. Other students would read the passage or study it, and then they wouldn't reread it, they'd put it away, and they'd try to write down everything they could remember. So that's the recall part. They tried to pull everything they had just read from memory, right, immediately after they finished reading. And then the investigators kind of looked at how much information the different groups of students could recall 5 minutes after they read the passage or they finished with the passages, 2 days later, and 1 week later. So they wanted to look at kind of immediate retention and then longer term retention out to 2 days and 1 week. So this is kind of their study findings. So you can kind of see here in the 5 minutes, this is the immediate 5 minutes, right? You see these two bar graphs, and the y-axis is the percentage of concepts, key concepts that the students could recall. And the black is the study condition. So this is, again, analogous to going through your notes once and then going through them again, right? The gray is the study recall condition. So this would be equivalent of like going through your notes and then trying to recall as much information as you could as possible. Again, a form of retrieval practice, right? And you see in that short-term recall, that immediate recall, the students who studied the passage twice or read the passage twice recalled approximately 80% of the information, key concepts that were included in the passages, right? Compared to only 75% for the students that read the passage and then to recall the information from memory, right? So when we look at short-term effects, it is very effective to just kind of keep rereading, right? We become more familiar every time we kind of pass through the information. So in the short term, we would say, hey, that kind of, passive rereading a passage or rereading our lecture notes is probably going to be more effective than trying to read and recall information from memory. So you're probably at this point like, why is he promoting retrieval practice then? It sounds like I should just keep going through my notes. Well, the story changed when they looked at the long-term effects, right? So this is looking at 2 days and this is looking at 1 week. And what you kind of see here is that the trend kind of reverses, right? You see that, when we're looking at the study condition where the students just read the passage twice, at day 2, they retained 54% of the key concepts, whereas the study recall group actually retained 68% of the key concepts, right? So when we get out to 2 days, the folks who just read the passage and then tried to recall as much as they could from memory actually retained more information. There was something magic had happened when they tried to pull that information from memory. And then we see the results kind of stayed that way when they extended out to 1 week, right? When they asked the people to come back in and explain as many concepts as they could, 42%, or the study group explained about 42% of the key concepts, or remembered or recalled about 42% of the core concepts, compared to 56% for the folks that added in that retrieval practice, that kind of active recall, trying to read and then recall what they remembered from memory. So the take-homes, the key takeaways is, yes, rereading is better in the short term. If you had a passage and your goal was to remember as much as you could 5 minutes later, you'd probably want to read it twice, right? But if your goal is actually to remember things in the longer term, you'd probably be better off to read it and then try to write down everything you could from memory, right? There's some magic, again, that happens when we try to pull information that we just read. It kind of strengthens those neural connections that we need for lasting memories, right? Now, the other interesting thing about this study, I thought, was kind of interesting to note, is that the study recall group didn't even get feedback on if what they recalled was complete or accurate. Just that process of trying to recall information kind of promoted longer term retention, right? So it was very interesting. So same investigators, Roediger and Karpicki, did another experiment. It was kind of part of the same paper. It was kind of a follow-up to their original study. So they had 180 undergraduate students this time. They were given the same written passages. And this time they broke it into a few more groups. They had a group that studied the passages 4 times, right? So they read the passage. They read the passage again, they read the passage again, and then they read the passage a 4th time. Then they had a group that read the passage 3 times and attempted to recall information again by writing everything they could remember down, right, after they had read. And then the 3rd group was just read it once, and then they attempted to recall as much information as they could 3 times. So think of it as like writing what you know, then taking a break, getting a new piece of paper, writing what you can remember, taking a break, getting a new piece of paper, writing what you can remember. So it's that heavy on the active recall or that retrieval practice. And then they just looked at kind of the short-term effects and then the longer-term effects. So 5 minutes and 1 week later, right? So we look at the results. The findings are pretty consistent with their first study in that if we look at the short-term effects, it looks like, so this is after 5 minutes, you can see that the group that studied the passages 4 times, so they read, reread, reread, and reread, remembered about 83% of the key concepts from the reading, right? The group that studied, and then attempted made one attempt at recall remembered about 78%. And then the group that just studied the passage once, read the passage once, and then attempted to recall 3 times only remembered about 71% of the information. So again, rereading, the more exposure you get to the information, the more times you reread it, the more familiar you become with the reading and the more you retain from it in the short term. But again, we see the results kind of completely flip if we look at the longer term outcomes. So this is after 1 week. You look at it in the group that reread the passages or read the passage and then reread it, so reading it a total of 4 times, remembered about 40% or recalled about 40% of the key concepts. The groups that read the passage once and then, or 3 times and then attempted to recall once, remembered about 56%. And then the winner in the long term was the group that just read the passage once and then made 3 attempts at trying to recall information from memory. So the big take home is that more opportunities for recall promoted better long-term retention. Again, if your goal is to remember things beyond the immediate, you probably want retrieval practice or active recall to be a big part of your study routine. And I think, you know, when you're thinking about this is, again, your goal is not just to study and then pass a test 5 minutes later. You're hoping to be able to retain this information for longer periods of time. Again, that's why I'd say active recall, there's a really strong basis for building that into your routine. Now, the other thing I'd like to highlight is this last point here, that they also, in this experiment, they asked students to predict what condition they thought they would perform best with. So they said, you know, they asked them, what percentage of these content do you think you're going to remember a week from now, right? And the students that were most confident were the ones who read the passage 4 times, even though they end up doing the worst. The students that were least confident were the students that just read the passage once and attempted to recall. So again, this is a kind of a unique thing that gives some insight into why students often adopt suboptimal study routines, because these students that kept reading through the passage thought they were going to retain a lot of the information. It's kind of like, you know, they had this illusion of competence, right? They were familiar with the passage. They became more familiar each time they read it, so they thought they'd be able to retain what was the key concepts. That turns out not to be true, right? It's actually the students that just read it once and made a few recall attempts that actually retained the most in that longer term 1 week period, right? So, you know, the benefits of retrieval practice, this should be a big part of your study routine. So, you know, the big thing is attempting to actively recall information tends to promote knowledge retention. And, you know, I know this Roediger and Karpicki's work is really kind of a, you know, contrived scenario. This is more of a research setting where you're asking students to, you know, read, you know, really specific passages and asking what they can retain. But there's been other studies that have studied this in more real world context of students learning for a course and then looking at their final exam performance, or students you know, in a classroom, more of a classroom setting. And again, active recall or retrieval practice, again, has been shown to be highly effective for, you know, your ability to retain information over longer periods of time. And there's also this idea that I think sometimes I get the questions like, well, you know, does that mean I have to like attempt to recall every little nuanced piece of information that's covered in the class? And the answer is probably no, right? There's this idea of retrieval-induced facilitation, they'll call it. And what it means is when I go to retrieve a certain piece of information from memory, it strengthens the storage and retrieval of related concepts. So other pieces of information, I think, that are stored in adjacent areas of the brain, right? So it's almost like if you were taking an exam, a practice exam, which we're going to talk about is a great way to incorporate retrieval practice, to try to answer exam questions from memory. You know, if you were asked a question or tried to answer a question from memory about how the mechanism of action of a neurotransmitter that you're learning about. It would actually probably, just trying to extract that information would probably consolidate or strengthen your memory of how that neurotransmitter is terminated, how its actions are terminated, because that's a related concept. Even though you weren't explicitly asked to pull that information, anything that's adjacent to that concept will kind of get strengthened as well. They'll call that retrieval-induced facilitation. So I like to think of it as getting some extra bang for your buck, right? When we try to retrieve information from memory, we strengthen these adjacent concepts or different ideas related to what we were trying to retrieve. So I think it's another benefit to highlight of incorporating this retrieval practice. So how can we effectively incorporate retrieval practice into our study routines? There's a lot of ways, but these are just some ideas that I've had students that I've worked with that have found to be effective and helpful. So the first is to write what you know from memory. This is exactly what Roediger and Karpicki had their students do in their study, right? They read something or they went to class and they would immediately, or even after a short delay, they would sit down with a blank piece of paper and just write everything they could remember. It's like the ultimate brain dump. Get it all out on paper, right? And what you could do then is then go back to your notes and kind of look back through them and start to fill in the gaps. Okay, these are the things I didn't remember, right? These are the things I kind of got stuck on, right? And then give yourself a break and go back and try it again, right? Now I'll try, maybe it's the next day, right? Try to write everything you can from memory. Again, get it down on paper. Again, the key is from memory. And what you'll find over time is that you start to see fewer and fewer gaps in your knowledge, right? You're able to extract more accurate and more complete information about whatever you're trying to learn, right? So that's a very simple and I think very effective way to incorporate retrieval practice, right? The other is to try answering questions, right? There's sometimes we'll refer to this active recall or retrieval practice as kind of the testing effect. Answering questions is a great way to promote learning, right? I think we always think of, as students, you always think of, oh, this is the way the instructor is going to assess me. But really answering questions when you're trying to pull information from memory actually facilitates learning. So it's not just an assessment, it's a way to learn, right? So just some tips there. One is that it looks like short answer questions tend to be a little bit more effective than multiple choice, with the idea that it's going to incorporate more retrieval practice if you have to pull information forward from memory, more of a short answer versus having multiple choice questions where you just have to read the question and then recognize the right response, right? So again, those short answers are probably going to promote more of that active recall retrieval practice. Not to say that multiple choice exams, practice exams aren't effective or helpful, but again, probably want to incorporate some short answers and stuff like that. So how do you get questions? A lot of students ask me this, like, I love that you tell us to take practice exams and practice quizzes and get exposure to different questions so we can build in some active recall, but where do you get the questions? Well, that's a good question. A lot of your textbooks will have banks of questions at the end. Sometimes even as online supplemental material, they'll have extra questions you could go through and stuff like that. Your instructor, a lot of times, maybe they'll give you a practice exam, or maybe they'll have quizzing built in throughout the semester so that they don't even care what your grade is. I do that a lot, right? I don't care what you get on my quizzes, but it's just a way for you to get exposure to questions and introduce some of this retrieval practice. You can also make up your own questions, which is great, right? And sometimes you can even run those by your instructor. Hey, I came up with these questions. Do you think these are good quality? And you can kind of work with your classmates to kind of share the load a little bit, to say, hey, I'll come up with 5 questions. If you come up with 5 questions, we'll share them. And, we learn a little bit by trying to come up with the questions. And then we also learn by, trying to answer them and retrieving information from memory. Kind of generative AI like ChatGPT is really effective in this area. I've started to use this, or encourage students to use this a little bit. I had students that were studying for a physiology exam, and I think they were learning about cardiac physiology. And I said, ask ChatGPT to generate 50 questions for you that are about cardiac physiology. And the nice thing is you can ask it to ask questions that are at different levels. I want it to focus more on application. I want it to focus more on just understanding, and it'll respond to you. And you have to check it whether the answers are right. ChatGPT is not infallible, or any of the generative AI is not infallible, right? It may have some errors built in, but that's a great opportunity too, right? Because then it forces you to stop and say, that doesn't make sense. Is it my understanding that doesn't align with what's true, or is this an error, right? So that's, again, one of those struggles that might help you learn. The other is to explain concepts from memory. That can be a highly effective form of retrieval practice. So this can be as simple as find a friend in class. Hey, I'll explain a concept to you, you explain a concept to me, right? It's beneficial for them to be able to verbalize it, especially, again, not looking at their notes, pulling information from memory. And it's also helpful for you to listen to their explanation, right? Because they may conceptualize different information in different ways that might be helpful for you. You may get exposure to different types of examples, those kinds of things, right? And it really, sometimes it's helpful even to explain concepts to somebody that has no understanding with the topic, right? It can be a parent, it could be a friend that's not in your class or in your major, and really, you probably don't even need a person there, right? You could just get that in that habit of kind of talking to yourself, right? Talking to yourself through concepts. Again, anything that's going to require you to pull information from memory is probably going to be helpful for your learning. Flashcards, a lot of students ask me about that, flashcards. I don't think it's a bad approach, right? But I think you want to use flashcards the right way. One is that make sure you make a real recall attempt before you look at the answer. I always see, students will look at their flashcards when they're studying for anatomy or something like that, and they'll look at it and they'll flip it over right away and flip it over right. And it's like, are you actually giving yourself enough time to try to pull that information forward? The other thing is sometimes the students will try to, understand definitions, and they'll have flashcards to remember definitions. And they'll have the definitions on one side and the term on the other. And they'll read the definition and try to figure out what the term is, right? And I would actually flip it. I would look at the term and see if you can explain the definition, right? Because this is going to push you to higher levels of blooms, right? Because now you're going to have to be able to say it in your own words, hopefully, if you move beyond just memorizing it. And it's also going to require you to recall or retrieve more information from memory. And the last would be like, a lot of times like anatomy, physiology, those kind of courses are heavy on figures, right? They may have a lot of figures and diagrams and stuff like that. I like to include, like block out some of the figure labels and see if I can label the figure from memory, right? If I even look at a graph and I say, well, this is something related to muscle force production, and I see this line going up and another line on the graph is going down, what would this represent, right? Is it different types of muscle fibers? Is it, is it the length of the muscle is changing and the force output? That process of trying to pull that information from memory and start to think about, okay, what is this actually trying to tell me, without just kind of looking at the slide and hoping it gets soaked up by the sponge that is your brain, right? Will probably be more effective for your learning in the long term, right? So final thoughts, this is one that I think has to be a big part of your study routine, is retrieval practice. Again, the evidence would suggest, not just Roediger and Karpicki studies, but there's been a lot of studies that have shown that retrieval practice is, or active recall is a real catalyst for learning, right? And it's going to be hard in the beginning, right? When you try to recall information. So you may sit through class, you may take notes, and then you may take a break. And then you may, let's say you had class in the afternoon, the next morning you wake up and you get your notepad out and you start to write everything you can remember. You may find that you don't remember much right away, right? And that's okay. That process of trying to pull information from memory is going to be helpful, even if it's hard, right? So this is another example of a desirable difficulty. It's something that promotes your learning, but isn't always easy, right? It takes a lot of cognitive effort to kind of pull this information forward.
If you enjoyed this content, be sure to like and subscribe to my YouTube channel, Learning That Lasts, and check out my book, Learning That Lasts, which is available on Amazon.